Hook, the night I erased every debt, was the night I signed my death certificate. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not looking for your sympathy. I am not confessing because I feel guilty. I am confessing because someone has to remember what happened in that warehouse on the night of October the 14th. And the only man who truly knew every detail of it was supposed to be dead by morning. I sat at my desk at 10 o'clock that evening with a leather-bound ledger in my hands. Black cover, gold spine, 37 names inside. 37 people who owed me something: money, loyalty, blood. The kind of debts that don't have payment plans. The kind of debts that end with someone's hands tied behind their back in a basement. By 11:58, every single name in that book had been crossed out. By midnight, I was walking into a building designed to kill me. And I walked in smiling. Introduction. My name is Dominic Cross. You won't find that name in any court filing. You won't find it in any FBI transcript, or at least not attached to anything they could ever prove. But if you spent enough time in the right rooms in the right cities, you'd hear it, whispered, carefully. The way people say the name of something they're afraid will hear them. I ran the Cross Syndicate for 11 years. We operated across 7 states. Port logistics, construction contracts, private security, all legitimate on the surface. Underneath, we were something else entirely. We were a machine, precise, cold, built to last. I was not born into this. My father was a longshoreman. My mother taught elementary school. I grew up with nothing, in a neighborhood where having nothing meant you either became invisible or you became dangerous. I chose dangerous, not because I loved violence, but because I understood early that power was the only language the world truly respected. I built my empire carefully, brick by brick, debt by debt. I learned that the most powerful force in the underworld is not a gun, it's an obligation. A man with a gun can be disarmed. A man who owes you something, his life, his freedom, his family's safety, that man cannot be disarmed. He is yours, completely. For 11 years, I collected those obligations. That ledger I mentioned, I kept it like a banker keeps a portfolio. Every favor, every loan, every time I looked the other way when I could have destroyed someone, every name was a chain, and I held all the chains. Then came the night of October the 14th. The night I burned every chain I owned. The night I walked into a room full of men who wanted me dead, with nothing in my hands and nothing left to lose. And the night I reminded every single one of them why they were afraid of me in the first place. But before I tell you what happened in that building, I need to tell you how I got there, because none of it makes sense without understanding the ledger. And none of the ledger makes sense without understanding the man who came for me. His name was Marcus Vane, and he made a very costly mistake. He underestimated how far a tired man will go when he has nothing left to protect. The ledger of blood. The ledger started as a notebook. Nothing special, black cover, college-ruled paper. I bought it from a drugstore in 2013 when I was 26 years old and still running corners for a man named Eddie Pratt who smelled like cigarettes and bad decisions. I used it to track product, how much came in, how much went out, who still owed. Basic arithmetic, the kind that could get you killed if the wrong person read it. But somewhere along the way, the notebook changed. The product stopped mattering as much as the people. I realized that tracking what a man owed me in money was less valuable than tracking what he owed me in circumstances. Did I bail him out of county before his wife found out he'd been arrested? Write it down. Did I keep my mouth shut when the feds came asking about his warehouse? Write it down. Did I loan him enough cash to keep his mother's house from foreclosure? Write it down. By the time I replaced the notebook with a proper leather-bound ledger, custom-made, pages edged in gold, I had 41 entries. 41 people whose lives intersected with mine in ways that left them permanently indebted. I reduced it to 37 over the years. 4 of them died, 2 in accidents, one of a heart attack, one because he tried to wriggle out of his debt in a way that I couldn't allow. 37 remained. The ledger had categories. At the front, the heavy debts, men who owed me their freedom or their lives. 2 city councilmen, 1 federal prosecutor who'd accepted a favor he should have refused, a police captain named Hargrove who I'd saved from a corruption investigation 3 years prior, a judge. These were my shields, my insurance, the reason the machine ran without friction. In the middle section, the financial obligations, street-level bosses who'd borrowed during lean years and never quite caught up, associates who'd needed bridges built across various difficult rivers. These were my revenue streams, but more importantly, they were my leverage over the mid-level power structures of the city. At the back, the personal ones, the ones that kept me up at night. A woman named Rosa whose husband had disappeared, not because I wanted to, but because he was going to talk, and talking would have destroyed everything. I paid Rosa for the rest of his life, not out of guilt, out of obligation. The ledger said I owed her something I could never fully repay. There was also a name I never spoke aloud. Page 36, 1 line. No amount listed, no date, no circumstances described, just a name. Dominic Cross. My brother. He'd come to me 8 years ago with a gambling debt that would have gotten him killed. I paid it. I erased him from that world, relocated him, set him up with a life so clean and so far from mine that I hadn't seen his face in 6 years. A debt I carried in that ledger not because he owed me, but because I owed him a normal life instead of this one. That ledger was not just a business document. It was a map of every piece of my soul I'd ever traded away. And on the night of October the 14th, I picked it up for the last time. I ran my thumb down every page, felt the weight of every name, and then I reached for a pen. But before I start crossing out those names, I need to tell you why. Because the why is where it gets complicated. Midnight is the deadline. I knew about the trap for 72 hours before it was supposed to spring. Marcus Vane had been in the city for 2 weeks. He'd come up from the South, Tampa originally, though he'd built his operation out of Charlotte over the past 4 years. He was younger than me by about 3 years, which in this business made him reckless and hungry, which is a dangerous combination. He'd taken over 2 territories in the past 18 months by doing what younger men always do, moving fast, hitting hard, and not caring about the mess he left behind. He'd set his eyes on my city 6 months ago. I'd known it before anyone told me because I could feel the shift. The way you feel a pressure change before a storm, small things, a shipping contract that went sideways, a contact who stopped returning calls, a rumor here, a withdrawal there. These aren't accidents. These are the opening moves of a man who is building towards something. 3 days before October 14th, a man named Terrence came to see me. Terrence drove a black BMW and wore shoes that cost more than most people's rent, but he'd started in the same streets I had, which meant I trusted him more than I trusted men who'd always had money. He sat across from me in my office, the real one, not the consulting firm I kept as a front, and he looked at me with the specific expression of a man who is about to deliver terrible news and is terrified of your reaction. Vane set a meeting, he said. Neutral ground, the Meridian warehouse on Fletcher. He wants to talk terms. I set down my glass. Terms. He's offering you a buyout, 20 cents on the dollar for your port contracts, and safe passage. Terrence paused. He said to tell you it's a one-time offer. The meeting is Friday, midnight. Friday was October 14th. I looked at Terrence for a long time. He shifted in his chair. You know it's a trap, I said. Obviously, he looked relieved that I'd said it first. Nobody's offering 20 cents and safe passage to Dominic Cross. That's not how this works. How many men does he have at the warehouse? Terrence hesitated. Our count is 16 inside, plus a perimeter team, maybe 8 more on the outside. 24 men. The Meridian warehouse, 6 stories, loading bays on the east side, roof access from the north stairwell, a basement that flooded during heavy rain. I'd been in that building twice before. I knew its geometry the way I knew the layout of my own home. And he's expecting me to walk in there alone, I asked. He's expecting you to walk in there with your usual security detail. 6 men, maybe 8. Terrence's voice dropped. He has enough firepower to handle 12. He's planned for you to bring backup. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. 24 men, a building I knew, a midnight deadline, and a man who had planned for every predictable version of me. The smart move was to not go, refuse the meeting, hit Vane somewhere else on my terms at a time of my choosing. That's what my men would counsel. That's what basic survival instinct demanded. But here's what nobody in that room understood, not Terrence, not any of my lieutenants, not Marcus Vane himself. I was tired. 11 years of this life had done something to me that no bullet had managed. It had hollowed me out slowly, the way water hollows limestone. I was functional on the outside. The machine still ran, but inside there was an emptiness where something human used to be. I'd been running so long I'd forgotten what I was running toward. And Marcus Vane, in his arrogance, had handed me something I hadn't expected. A reason. Not a reason to run. A reason to end it on my terms, in the most complete way I could imagine. I picked up the ledger. I'm going to the meeting, I told Terrence. He stared at me. Dominic. I'm going to the meeting, I said again. But first I have some calls to make. He left. I sat alone in my office with the ledger and the weight of 37 obligations. And I started dialing. The rival's offer. I need to tell you about Marcus Vane properly, because the way you understand him changes the way you understand everything that followed. He wasn't a thug. That's the first thing. Thugs are easy to deal with. They think in straight lines and they make mistakes because they can't see past the immediate problem in front of them. Marcus Vane thought in spirals. He was the kind of man who played chess and actually meant it as a metaphor for his life. He had an MBA from Duke. His father had run legitimate construction in the Carolinas for 30 years before Vane took over, kept the legitimate side running, and quietly built the other side underneath it. He wore suits that cost $4,000. He spoke softly and deliberately, the way people do when they know their words have weight. And he had figured out something about my operation that most people hadn't. He'd figured out that my real power wasn't money or men or territory. It was the ledger. 2 weeks before he sent Terrence to me with the meeting offer, Vane had sent me a different message, privately, through a channel so clean it took me a day to trace it. He'd sent me a folder. Inside the folder were photographs, financial records, communications. It was everything I had on Judge Callahan, on Councilman Pierce, on Captain Hargrove. He hadn't gotten it from me, which meant he'd gotten it from someone close to me. The folder came with a note, handwritten. His handwriting was precise, the letters perfectly formed, which told you something about the man. The note read, I know what's in your ledger, Dominic. I know who owes you and why, which means I know what happens if those names become public. Your protection disappears. Your infrastructure dissolves. You become vulnerable in ways you haven't been since the beginning. Walk away from the city, take your money, or meet me at the Meridian. Let's discuss which future you prefer. I read that note 3 times. Then I burned it. Here's what Vane had understood correctly. The ledger was my power. Here's what he'd misunderstood. He thought the ledger was my anchor. He thought I clung to those obligations the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. He didn't understand that for a man who is already drowning, letting go of the driftwood is not destruction. It's freedom. He'd built his trap around the assumption that I would protect those names at all costs, that I would negotiate, compromise, retreat, anything to keep the ledger safe. Instead, I chose the third option. the one he hadn't planned for. What happens when you remove all the leverage your enemy thinks he holds? What happens when you walk into his trap with nothing he can threaten you with? He has to face you as you actually are. Not as the man with obligations, not as the man protecting assets, just you and him and whatever you're actually made of. Marcus Vane had never met that version of me. He was about to. The first forgiveness, the first call I made, was the one I'd been dreading for 3 years. His name was Victor Salcedo. He ran distribution for my Western Corridor, the routes that moved product from the port through 4 different handoff points before it reached its final destinations. Victor was good at his job, methodical, reliable. For 7 years, he was one of the 3 men I trusted most in the entire operation. 3 years ago, Victor made a mistake that cost me 2 men and $140,000. He moved a shipment before I authorized it, panicked when he heard about a federal inspection, rerouted without telling me, and walked it directly into an independent crew who hit the transport and took everything. 2 of my drivers were killed in the takedown. Not executed, they died fighting, which made it worse somehow, because they died for a shipment that should never have been moving in the first place. Victor came to me afterward. He didn't run. He could have. He had enough connections to disappear. Instead, he drove to my office, sat down across from me and told me everything. Exactly what happened, exactly what he'd done and why. He didn't make excuses. He looked me in the eyes and said, "I panicked. It was my call and it was wrong. I understand what that means." He meant it as an acknowledgement that he expected to die. I let him believe that for 6 weeks. I kept him running his corridor, watching him work, watching him carry the weight of what he'd done. Some men break under that kind of sustained dread. Victor didn't. He worked harder. He was more careful. He checked in more frequently. He was, in those 6 weeks, the best version of himself because he thought every day might be his last, and he wanted to be worth something before the end. After 6 weeks, I called him in. He sat down and he was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that comes from deciding to stop fighting. "You knew you were wrong before you did it," I told him. "You just didn't know how wrong." "Yes," he said. "You've been carrying it. Every day." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "The debt stands. You'll repay the money over 4 years and the obligation stays in the ledger. But you walk out of here today, and you never make that kind of decision again without calling me first." He was so relieved, he couldn't speak for almost a minute. For 3 years, he'd been repaying faithfully. He still had 14 months left on the financial portion. The obligation in the ledger, of course, had no end date. On the night of October 14th, at 10:15, I called Victor. He picked up on the second ring. "Dominic." "Victor, stop paying the debt." "Silence, what?" "The remaining 14 months. Stop. It's cleared." I paused. "And the other thing, the obligation, that's cleared too. You don't owe me anything from tonight forward." More silence, longer this time. "Dominic, what's happening?" "I'm restructuring," I said. It was both true and completely evasive. "Your family good?" Yeah, they're good." His voice had changed, thickened slightly. "Dominic." "Take care of them," I said. "That's all." I hung up. I opened the ledger to Victor's page and drew a single line through his name. That was the first one. The next call took longer because the debt involved was not financial at all, and the man on the other end had done something to me that had nothing to do with business. His name was Edward Marsh, and 8 years ago, before I was powerful enough to protect the people I loved, he had done something to my family that I had spent every subsequent year planning to repay. He was the last person in that ledger who I thought I could ever forgive, which is exactly why I called him. "Marsh." A long pause. He recognized my voice. Of course he did. "Dominic." "I've been carrying something for 8 years, I said. "I want you to know I'm setting it down tonight. What you did, what happened, I'm not coming for you. Not now, not ever, it's done. I could hear him breathing, shallow, rapid. I don't understand, he said finally. You don't have to, I said. Just live your life, Marsh, make it worth the second chance. I hung up before he could respond, because I didn't want to hear gratitude. Gratitude would have made it feel like mercy. It wasn't mercy. It was me, choosing to stop being the man who lived for revenge, even if only for one night. My men thought I was weak. By 11 o'clock, word had gotten around. I hadn't been subtle about the calls. My office was in my home, a Georgian colonial in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors assumed I was in commercial real estate, which was technically not inaccurate, and my lieutenants had access to the house. 3 of them were there that night. Terrence, who'd brought me Vane's offer and hadn't left since. A man named Cole, my head of security, 6'4" and quiet in the way that large men sometimes are, as if the space they occupy requires careful management. And a woman named Petra, who ran my financial operations and was the most frightening person in the building, which was saying something. They heard me on the phone, they heard the tone, they heard enough. Cole came to find me at 11:15 while I was at my desk, still working through the ledger. He knocked twice, which was his way of asking permission, then came in and stood in front of the desk. I need to talk to you, he said. Sit down, Cole. He sat, he looked at the ledger. He looked at the pen in my hand. He looked at me. You're clearing the debts, he said. I am. All of them. All of them. He was quiet for a moment. Cole was not a man who wasted words. When he spoke, it was because he'd already thought through what he wanted to say and decided it was worth the air. The meeting tonight, he said. You're going. Yes. You know what it is. Yes. Another silence. Then Cole did something he almost never did. He leaned forward, put his elbows on his knees, and spoke in a register I'd only heard from him twice before, direct, personal, unguarded. Dominic, clearing those debts before you walk in there, you know what that looks like. Tell me what it looks like, Cole. It looks like a man who doesn't think he's coming back. He met my eyes. It looks like you're saying goodbye. I set the pen down. Or, I said slowly, it looks like a man who has decided to stop letting an enemy hold leverage over him through the people he's protected. Cole shook his head. That's not all it is. He was right, but I wasn't ready to give him the full truth. Petra came in next. She was wearing a gray blazer over dark jeans, her hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She didn't sit. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and looked at me with the expression she used when a set of numbers didn't add up the way they should. You cleared Hargrove, she said. The judge, Pierce. I did. Those are our most significant institutional protections, if they're no longer obligated. They weren't really obligated because of the ledger, Petra. I kept my voice even. They were obligated because of what they'd done. That doesn't change because I told them the debt is clear. They still did what they did. But they're no longer afraid of you. No, I agreed, they're not. She stared at me. The analytical mask she wore at all times slipped just slightly. What showed underneath was something I hadn't seen from her before. Not fear, not confusion, something closer to grief. You're not doing this for strategy, she said quietly. Are you? It wasn't a question. Then came the one that truly surprised me. Terrence. He'd been listening from the hallway, I'd known he was there, and now he stepped through the doorway and he was not the measured, careful man who'd sat across from me earlier that evening. His jaw was set. His eyes were hard. You're weak, he said. The room went absolutely still. Cole turned slowly to look at Terrence. Petra went rigid. Terrence didn't flinch. I said it. You're being weak. Vane is coming for your empire and you're sitting here giving away your leverage like you're distributing alms. You're walking into a death trap with nothing. That's not dignity, Dominic. That's surrender with extra steps. I looked at Terrence for a long time. "How long have we known each other?" I asked. He blinked. 9 years. "In 9 years, have you ever seen me surrender?" "No." "Have you ever seen me act without reason?" A pause. "No." "Then you might want to ask yourself," I said, picking up the pen again, "whether you understand what's actually happening here, or whether you're just afraid." He left without saying anything else. But here's the thing I didn't tell Terrence that night. Here's the thing that was burning in my chest as I watched him walk out. Of all the people in that room, Terrence was the one I was watching most carefully. Because there was something off about him, something small, something almost invisible. He delivered Vane's message too cleanly. The snake in my house. Let me tell you how I knew. It wasn't one thing. It never is. Betrayal is like water damage. By the time you see the stain on the ceiling, the rot has been building for months. You trace it backward, and suddenly all the small things make sense. The Vane folder. The one he'd sent me 2 weeks ago with the photographs of Hargrove, Pierce, Callahan. That intelligence had to come from somewhere. The files he'd shown me were not surveillance. They were internal documents, the kind that only existed in my records. The kind that Terrence, in his role coordinating my citywide operations, would have had access to. But I didn't have proof. And in my world, moving on suspicion alone is how good men die and guilty men escape. So I'd done what I always did. I'd set a test. 3 months ago, I'd given 4 different people 4 different pieces of false information, each one slightly different. A shipment that didn't exist, a route that I'd fabricated, a financial account with a made-up number, a name of an informant completely fictional that I'd dropped into 4 separate conversations. 6 weeks later, I had an unexpected visit from the FBI. An agent named Corrigan who was a little too friendly, who knew a little too much, who mentioned, almost casually, a name that he should not have known unless someone had told him. The fictional informant's name. The version I had given to Terrence. I didn't react. I gave Corrigan nothing. I smiled and offered him coffee and told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He left, and I sat in my office alone for a long time, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Grief. Not anger, not the cold calculation that usually follows discovery of a betrayal, just grief. Because Terrence had been in my life for 9 years. I'd known him before I was powerful. I'd trusted him with things I didn't trust anyone else with. I'd kept his name out of my ledger, not because he didn't owe me, but because I'd never wanted to formalize our relationship that way. He was supposed to be something different from an obligation. He was supposed to be a friend. And now, on the night of October the 14th, as I sat in my office with the ledger, I understood the full architecture of Marcus Vane's plan. Vane hadn't just sent Terrence to deliver the meeting offer. He'd been using Terrence for months. Every operational detail Terrence knew, my security protocols, my regular routes, my communication patterns, all of it had been flowing to Vane's people. The meeting at the Meridian warehouse wasn't just a trap. It was a perfectly tailored trap, designed specifically around the version of me that Terrence had described to Vane, my usual behavior, my predictable responses, my habits. Which meant that by now, Vane knew I'd received the meeting offer. He knew I was deciding. He almost certainly believed that I would either refuse and need to be dealt with another way, or I would attend with 6 to 8 security personnel and walk into his prepared ambush. He did not know that I'd found the leak. He did not know that I was stripping the ledger clean. He did not know that I intended to walk into his building in a way that no amount of preparation could account for. And here is the thing about Terrence. I did not confront him. I did not have him detained. I did not remove him from the house. I let him stay. I let him watch me clear the ledger. I let him call Vane with updates. Because the information Terrence was feeding Vane tonight was information I was curating. Every phone call he'd overheard was a call I'd made knowing he was listening. Every piece of my apparent strategy that reached Vane through Terrence was a piece I'd placed there deliberately. By 11:30, Vane believed I was walking into his building emotionally compromised, stripped of leverage, possibly suicidal, definitely not thinking clearly. Let him believe it. That was the point. The debt funeral. At 11:40, I put down the phone for the last time. 37 names, 37 calls, some quick, a name, a number, a crossed line done. Some long conversations that required weight, required acknowledgement. Required me to say things out loud that I'd spent years keeping inside. Because a man in my position doesn't speak openly about his regrets. He buries them where they can't be used against him. The last call was Rosa. She picked up in 2 rings. I could hear a television in the background, her children's voices somewhere farther away. Rosa, I said. Mr. Cross. She'd always called me that, never my first name. It maintained a distance between us that we both understood was necessary. I want you to know that the monthly payment will continue. I'd set up an account years ago, an anonymous disbursement through a trust. But from tonight, it comes without any strings, without any obligation on your part. You don't owe me silence. You don't owe me anything. A long pause. I don't know what to say to that, Mr. Cross. You don't have to say anything. I paused. I'm sorry, Rosa. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I am. She didn't respond. I hadn't expected her to. I hung up and sat with that call for a moment, just a moment. Then I closed the ledger. I carried it to the fireplace in my study. Real fire. I'd always preferred it to gas. The logs had been burning for hours and the coals were deep and orange and very hot. I held the ledger in my hands for a long moment, felt its weight. The leather was soft from years of handling. The gold spine caught the firelight. 11 years of my life, compressed into 140 pages. I put it in the fire. It caught slowly, leather burns reluctantly, as if it knows what it contains. The edges blackened first, then the back cover curled. Then the pages began to go, one by one, the names becoming smoke, the obligations becoming ash, and there was something terrible and something beautiful about watching it burn. And I stood there until there was nothing left in the fireplace but gray and orange and the ghost of 37 lives that were no longer mine to hold. I still had the lighter in my hand. My father's lighter, the only thing he'd given me that I'd kept. A plain Zippo silver with his initials scratched into the side. James Cross. He died when I was 19, a longshoreman to the end, calloused hands and honest eyes. He would have been horrified by the man I'd become. Or maybe not. Maybe he would have recognized the hunger for control that came from growing up with none. I slipped the lighter into my breast pocket. Then I went to the safe behind the bookcase. Inside, next to the usual contents, was a sealed envelope and a small recording device. The envelope contained a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, in my smallest and most precise handwriting. The recording device held an audio file I'd recorded the previous night, speaking directly into the microphone for 47 minutes. The letter was addressed to my brother Daniel. I'd been writing it in pieces over 4 years, adding paragraphs when something felt important enough to say. It contained everything I could never say in person about our childhood, about the choices I'd made, about the machinery of guilt that had run underneath everything I'd built. And it contained specific instructions for a set of accounts he didn't know existed, containing enough money to give him and his family 3 generations of security. The recording was for the FBI, specifically for Agent Corrigan, who had been investigating me for 4 years without being able to build a complete case. The recording contained exactly what he needed: names, dates, transactions, carefully chosen to dismantle Marcus Vane's operation without exposing the people in my former ledger. I'd spent weeks considering which threads to pull and which to leave alone. The goal was to create a vacuum that could be filled cleanly, not a bomb that would detonate in every direction. I gave both items to Cole before I left. If I don't call you by 2 a.m., I told him, the letter goes to Daniel. The recording goes to Agent Corrigan, FBI field office, sealed. Cole looked at the items in his hands. Then he looked at me. I want to come with you, he said. I know. Dominic. Cole, I put my hand on his shoulder. He was one of the largest men I'd ever known, and in that moment he looked very young. Trust me. He didn't say anything else. He stepped back. He held the envelope and the recording like they were fragile things. I also took off my ring. It was a simple band. Black metal, no stones. I'd worn it for 9 years, not a wedding ring, not a signet ring, just a ring I'd bought the day I took over my first real territory, as a reminder of the specific day everything changed. I set it on my desk. Then I picked up my jacket. And I walked out. The ride to the slaughter. It was raining. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that hammers the windows and turns the streets into rivers. Just a steady, gray, indifferent rain that came straight down and soaked everything slowly and evenly, the way real trouble comes. Not the storm you see from miles away, but the kind that's already all around you before you think to check the sky. I drove myself. That was the first deviation from what Vane expected. Terrence, watching me leave the house, would report that I'd taken my personal vehicle alone. Vane had planned for a convoy, 6 to 8 men, a security formation. He had snipers positioned with that in mind, exit points blocked to handle an organized retreat. One man alone in a dark sedan was already outside his planning. I drove through the rain and I let myself think. That's the thing nobody tells you about this life. The waiting is the worst part. Not the violence. Violence is fast. It occupies your entire body and there's no room for thought, only reaction. But the ride to violence, the space between the decision and the consequence, that's where the mind goes to dark places. I thought about my father's hands. Big, weathered hands that smelled like machine oil. He used to grip the steering wheel of our old Buick with both hands, every time, even on a straight road, as if he needed to hold on. I'd thought it was a nervous habit. Now, driving through the rain, I gripped my wheel with both hands and wondered if it was something else entirely. If it was just the particular way men like us hold onto the things we love. I thought about Daniel, his laugh which I hadn't heard in 6 years, his daughter who I'd never met. I thought about Rosa and the sound of her children in the background, and what it meant that the man responsible for their father's absence was the same man paying for their school fees. I thought about all the things I would do differently. I was not, by nature, a man who spent time on regret. But the rain was coming down, and the city was quiet, and the building I was driving toward was going to be full of people who wanted me dead. And it seemed like an appropriate moment to let in the regrets I usually kept locked out. I parked 3 blocks from the Meridian warehouse. I didn't use the obvious approaches. Vane's perimeter team would be watching those. I'd studied the building. I knew there was a drainage channel running underneath the east wall, part of the original industrial architecture, wide enough for a man to move through if he didn't mind getting wet and staying low. It connected to the basement, the one that flooded in heavy rain. Tonight was heavy rain. I killed the engine and sat in the dark for exactly 2 minutes. Not planning, I'd done all the planning already. Just sitting, feeling the weight of the lighter in my breast pocket, my father's lighter. Then I got out of the car. The rain hit me immediately, cold and relentless. I didn't run. I walked at a steady, measured pace, staying in the shadows, moving parallel to the building rather than toward it, working my way around to the eastern side. I found the drainage channel. The grate was old, bolted down, the kind of thing city maintenance probably hadn't checked in 20 years. I'd had it inspected 6 weeks ago by a man I trusted, who'd confirmed it was passable. He'd also confirmed something else. The drainage channel connected to an adjacent system that ran beneath the loading bay, and from there, through a utility access point into the warehouse basement. I went in. Cold water, darkness, the smell of concrete and rust, and something biological I chose not to identify. I moved on my hands and knees through 200 feet of drainage channel, absolutely controlled, breathing through my nose, feeling the walls with my fingertips. I wasn't alone, but I'll get to that. I emerged in the basement of the Meridian warehouse at 11:53, 7 minutes to midnight. The basement was flooded just as I'd expected, just as it had been described, with about 6 inches of standing water. The industrial lights overhead were off. The only light came from the floor above, filtering down through gaps in the concrete, in thin yellow lines that cut across the dark water like incisions. I stood in the water and listened. Above me, footsteps, voices low and controlled, the sounds of men in position, waiting, the specific silence of people who are expecting something and ready for it. 24 men, waiting for Dominic Cross to walk through the front door. I checked my jacket, reached into the inner pocket. I'd brought 2 things, my father's lighter and a phone. No gun, no backup, no conventional weapon. Because I wasn't there to fight 24 men. I was there to end it. And I had been building toward this specific ending for 6 weeks. The death trap springs. At 11:58, 2 minutes before midnight, the front door of the Meridian warehouse opened. I know what happened up there because I had the feed. Cole, I told you I went alone. That was true in a specific sense. I drove alone. I entered the building alone. But 3 weeks earlier, Cole had spent 4 hours in this building with 2 men I trusted absolutely, men who appeared nowhere in any ledger, men whose connection to me existed in no document and no record. They were in and out in 4 hours, and when they left behind 18 miniature cameras and 12 remote-controlled devices that I won't describe in detail, but whose purpose should become clear. I watched the front door open on my phone, in the basement, standing in 6 inches of cold water. What walked through that door was not me. It was a man named Felix. He was 63 years old, 5'11", roughly my build, wearing a coat identical to one of mine. He'd worked for me for 12 years. He knew exactly what he was walking into, and he'd agreed to do it, which I'll explain in a moment. Felix walked in calmly, slowly. He moved the way I move, measured, deliberate, hands visible, nothing aggressive. He walked into the main floor of the warehouse where Marcus Vane's 16 men were waiting in the shadows, and he got about 30 feet in before someone turned on the overhead lights. "Stop there." Felix stopped. "Where are your men?" Felix reached into his jacket slowly and produced a phone. He set it on the floor and stepped back. On the phone screen, my face, live, me standing in the basement, 6 inches of water around my feet, looking directly into the camera. "Marcus," I said, "look at your perimeter." Upstairs, I could hear the shift, the sudden communication between Vane's men, the radios crackling. Because outside the Meridian warehouse at that moment, Vane's perimeter team of 8 men was discovering that they were surrounded. Not by my men, I told you. I didn't bring an army. They were surrounded by FBI. 40 agents in tactical gear, coordinated through Agent Corrigan, who had received a very detailed anonymous tip at 9 o'clock that evening about a criminal organization gathering at the Meridian warehouse, armed, with intent. The tip had included the building's blueprints, and the specific locations of every exit, and the entry codes for the warehouse's security system. All information that had been compiled over 6 weeks by Cole and his team, working quietly, invisibly, while Terrence kept feeding Vane the story of an emotionally compromised man making reckless decisions. Vane's voice came through the phone. He'd taken Felix's phone. He was looking at my face, and he was very controlled, very quiet, in the way that intelligent men go quiet when they realize they've miscalculated. "You called the FBI," he said. "I did." "You're in the building." I am. You're going to be arrested. Possibly, I said. But here's the difference between us, Marcus. I prepared for that. You prepared for a gunfight. And there's no gunfight tonight. There's just federal agents and a building full of people with illegal firearms and no plausible explanation for why they're here. A silence. I could hear him thinking he was fast. I'd known he was fast. My lawyers. Your lawyers will help you. I genuinely hope they do. I wasn't being sarcastic. I meant it. But the evidence that's going to that federal office tonight is specific to you, Marcus, not to anyone else. What you built in Charlotte, what you moved through the ports. I've been watching you for 8 months. I know your operation better than you think. Another silence, much longer this time. You didn't come here to die, he said. His voice had changed. The careful composure was still there, but underneath it was something more human, something I hadn't expected from him. No, I said. You came here to finish it. I came here, I said, to make sure that everything ends the way I choose. Not the way you choose, not the way the city chooses, me. Outside, the sound of vehicles, agents moving, Vane's perimeter team going down one by one, not in gunfire but in handcuffs, which was its own kind of ending. Inside, the 16 men on the main floor, looking at each other, calculating. What happened next was where Felix comes back into the story. Felix was 63 years old and he had a debt in the ledger, had a debt past tense, because I'd cleared it like all the others. His debt had been significant. Years ago, in a very different period, Felix had been arrested, and I had arranged his release in a way that required me to call in a favor I'd been saving for something important. Felix had walked free, and for 12 years, he'd worked for me in a very specific capacity. Felix was a former federal prosecutor. He'd left that life under circumstances that were complicated, and he'd spent 12 years as what I called my legal architect, the man who understood exactly how evidence was assembled and prosecuted, which meant he understood exactly how it could be made airtight or made to fall apart. He was the reason I'd never been successfully charged. When I'd cleared his debt and offered him the choice to walk away, he'd surprised me. He'd asked if he could help instead. What Felix had brought with him, in an attaché case that he'd set down near the door of the Meridian warehouse before the lights came on, was a complete and immaculate legal package. Evidence pertaining to Marcus Vane's operation, organized in a way that a federal prosecutor would find irresistible. Chain of custody documentation, financial records, witness statements from people who were, independently, willing to testify, and whose willingness had nothing to do with my ledger or my coercion. Agent Corrigan would find that case. It would make his career. And it would end Marcus Vane's completely. Upstairs, I could hear the sounds of men making decisions. Vane 16, calculating their odds, hearing the FBI outside, understanding that the building was contained. There was no tactical play available to them. Running meant federal charges. Fighting meant federal charges plus assault. Surrendering meant federal charges with a cooperative framing. One by one, they chose to cooperate. It took 11 minutes. No gunshots, no blood, no bodies. Just the sound of men who had come to a slaughter, discovering that the man they'd planned to kill had already changed the nature of the game entirely. At 12:14, I walked up from the basement, soaking wet, unarmed, hands visible. And I walked into the main floor of the Meridian warehouse, where Agent Corrigan was standing with a look on his face that I will never forget. Not triumph, not anger, something closer to bafflement. Marcus Vane was in handcuffs against the far wall. He looked at me. His face was composed. He was still the most controlled man I'd ever faced. But his eyes told the truth. In his eyes, I could see the specific thing that no amount of composure can hide. The recognition of being outplayed completely by a man he'd thought he understood. The masterpiece. Here's what happens when you give the FBI everything they need on your enemy and nothing they can use against you. They arrest him. They look at you very carefully. And then they let you go. Agent Corrigan pulled me aside in the warehouse. Corrigan was in his mid-40s, ex-military, the kind of straight-backed, direct-eyed man who'd built a career on being impossible to manipulate. He'd been trying to build a case against me for 4 years. He'd gotten close twice, never close enough. He looked at me for a long moment in the yellow industrial light, with men in tactical gear moving around us and Marcus Vane's people being processed against the warehouse walls. The attaché case, Corrigan said, that's clean. Completely, I said. Every document has unimpeachable provenance. Every witness is independent. You'll find nothing in there that touches me or my people. How convenient. Yes, I agreed, it is. He looked at me steadily. You know I'm not done with you. I know, I said, but tonight you have something more important to be done with. Use it well. He let me leave. I walked out of the Meridian warehouse into the rain. The FBI vehicles were everywhere. The perimeter team was in custody. Vane's operation in this city was finished, not just disrupted, finished. The case Corrigan was now holding would take Vane's entire structure apart, layer by layer. I walked 3 blocks through the rain to my car. I sat inside for a moment. Then I called Cole. 2 a.m. hasn't come yet, he said immediately. Should I? Keep the letter, I said. Send the recording anyway to Corrigan. Different channel than the case, send it to his personal email. It's time. A pause. Dominic, that recording is. I know what it is, send it. I paused. And Cole, the operation wraps. Tonight, you and Petra take what I've set aside and you build something clean with it. I've left the structures, you know what to do. And Terrence, Cole's voice was very quiet. Nothing happens to Terrence, I said. He made his choices. Let him live with them. The FBI will find him eventually through their investigation of Vane. That's enough. I could hear Cole breathing. I could hear the weight of what I was doing settling onto him. Where are you going? He asked. I thought about Daniel, about a daughter I'd never met, about 6 years of silence and a letter I'd been writing for 4. I'm going to see my brother, I said. Now let me tell you the final piece, the one I haven't told you yet. The recording I had Cole send to Agent Corrigan, the 47-minute audio file, did not contain evidence against Marcus Vane. That evidence was in the attaché case. What the recording contained was something different. It was a confession. Not a complete one. Not names, dates, specific transactions. Nothing that could be used to build an indictable case against anyone still living. I'd been too careful for that, and Felix had ensured the legal architecture held. But it was an honest accounting. 47 minutes of my voice speaking plainly, describing what I'd built and how I'd built it and what it had cost in human terms. Not names, not evidence, just truth. I sent it to Corrigan because I wanted someone to know. I wanted there to be a record somewhere in the hands of a man incorruptible enough to keep it honestly, that Dominic Cross had existed, that he'd done what he'd done, that he'd understood, finally, what it cost. Corrigan called me 2 days later. He'd listened to the whole thing. This is inadmissible, he said. I know, I said. You know I'll keep looking. I know, I said. A long pause. Then Corrigan said something I hadn't expected. Is it worth it, whatever you're walking away to? I thought about it honestly. Ask me in a year, I said. I drove through the night. 800 miles to a small city in a state I won't name, where a man who shared my blood was living a life I'd paid for and never visited. It took 11 hours. I stopped once for coffee and once for gas. I watched the rain eventually stop, and the sky eventually lighten, and the road eventually become rural, and then become the kind of quiet that I'd never known in my adult life. I parked outside my brother's house at 7 in the morning. It was a modest house, a porch with a swing, a yard with a child's bicycle tipped over in the grass. The lights were on inside, early risers, both of them. I somehow already knew that. I sat in the car for a very long time. I'm not a man who is afraid of many things. I have been afraid 3 times in my life. Once as a child, once the night I made a decision that cost a man named David Rosa his life, and once sitting outside my brother's house at 7 in the morning wondering if any version of this story had a clean ending. The front door opened. Daniel stepped out onto the porch. He was 38 now, heavier than when I'd last seen him, with gray beginning at his temples. He had his coffee in both hands. He looked at my car for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He'd recognized me. Of course he had. 6 years changes a man's face, but not his brother's ability to see through it. He stood on the porch for a moment. Then he raised his coffee cup, just slightly, the most understated greeting I'd ever received. I got out of the car. In my breast pocket, I still had my father's lighter. I'd carried it in and out of every situation that night. The fire that burned the ledger, the 6 inches of standing water in the basement, the warehouse and the rain and the 11-hour drive. When I reached the porch, Daniel looked at me with a specific expression that only exists between brothers who have been through something large and unspoken. No preamble, no explanation, just recognition. "You look terrible," he said. "I've had a night," I said. He opened the door. "Come inside. What I've just told you is the version I've carried for the past 4 years." The machine dismantled itself after I left. Petra was meticulous. She'd always been meticulous. The transition took 18 months and generated nothing the FBI could build a case around. Cole built something legitimate. Small, careful, profitable. He calls me occasionally. He never asks questions I can't answer. That's why I still pick up. Marcus Vane was convicted on 31 federal counts. He received 40 years. His appeal is pending. It will fail. Felix's package was too clean and Corrigan was too thorough. Terrence cooperated with the federal investigation of Vane's operation, which meant he got a reduced sentence in 4 years. He tried to implicate me in the process. He had nothing concrete. I'd spent years being careful about what Terrence knew and didn't know, which is why I'd suspected him to begin with. The implication led nowhere. He served his time. I've been told he moved north afterward. I don't look for him. There's nothing to settle. Agent Corrigan still looks for me. He's thorough and he's patient and he believes in his work the way men of genuine integrity believe in things. I respect him. I hope he doesn't find what he's looking for. I think he probably will eventually, and I have made a kind of peace with that. My niece is 10 years old. Her name is June. She has her father's eyes and her mother's laugh and no knowledge whatsoever of who her uncle used to be. I've been present for 3 of her birthdays. She has decided I am funny, which is the highest compliment a 10-year-old gives, and I treasure it more than any power I've ever held. The lighter sits on the windowsill in the small house I rent in a city I won't name. In the morning, when the light comes in and hits it, it catches and holds it in a way that the gold spine of the ledger used to do. And I think about what it means to carry a thing for a long time, and then learn how to simply set it down. Not everything I did was redeemable. I'm not telling this story because I believe in my own redemption. I'm telling it because the night I walked into that warehouse, with nothing in my hands, and nothing left to lose, and nothing left to protect except the faint possibility of a different ending, that night taught me something I'd spent 11 years refusing to learn. The most powerful thing a man can do is release his grip. Not because it makes him weak, but because a man who holds nothing cannot be held. Marcus Vane built his trap around a version of me that needed the ledger, that needed the debts, that would fight to protect the leverage he thought he understood. He was not wrong about what I had been. He was wrong about what I decided to become. On the night of October the 14th, Dominic Cross, the man who ran the Cross Syndicate for 11 years, who held 37 lives in a leather-bound ledger, who built an empire from nothing and protected it by collecting the debts of the desperate. That man burned his own ledger and walked into the dark. He did not die. He just became someone else. And that, I think, is the harder thing. Because dying like a king only requires one night of courage. Living like a man requires every morning after.